Hello everyone and welcome to another creature breakdown video. We are finally taking a look at the elementals, the very basic of Shard TCG. Now what's different about the elementals is that they use mana instead of shards because they are soulless magical creatures. So that's the explanation. We're just going to dive straight in and we're going to start off with the Specter. Now just a warning, all the elementals have the same effect, so there's not as much detail as I can go through with all these creatures, but that's probably a good thing because there's 21 of them, where before then the most we ever had was 11, so it's literally twice as long. Okay, so yes, we've got the Specter. It has elemental aura. Now a brief explanation as well for people who don't know. In Shard TCG, creatures can be very positional based. So with elemental aura, adjacent creatures that are the same element as this creature deal +1 combat damage. So the Spectre is great at buffing its allies that are alongside of it, whether it's to the left or the right, and they'll give them +1 attack strength. It's got a nice banishing effect attached to its attack, Occult Tendril. This means that when a creature is destroyed, instead of going to the graveyard, it'll actually go straight to the void. So it's a good way of stopping undead decks and things like that, things that want to come back from the graveyard. Okay, and next up is the Wraith. It's a lovely little flaming skull. Who doesn't love a flaming skull? Anyway, it has an attack called Hell Fury, and the attack has strengthening. So what's tied into the nether element is like a strength, like a building of rage, if you think of it that way. So the more it attacks, the stronger it gets. So think of it as if it's just getting angrier and angrier. So when the Wraith attacks, it gains strengthening after the attack. So next time that it performs attack, it won't be inflicting 2 damage, it'll be inflicting 3 damage. And then it can go on and so forth as long as it stays on the field up to a maximum of 5 strength. So it can go up to a maximum of 7 damage. Then we're diving straight into the Sylph, and the Sylph has Valiant Front at its Block Fear. And a little thought on Block Fear as a combo. Perhaps Block Fear should nullify swarm attacks as well. Just a thought there. Just because the whole idea of fear is isolation. It would just be an interesting concept to actually try out, where normally a block fear will just prevent your opponent from backing up their attacking creature with spells. Alright, and the Tremor, and the great thing about Tremors is they're all about vibrations, earthquakes, sound waves, lots of things like that. So naturally, a shockwave attack will have a splash effect, which is something I've explained in a recent video as well, but I'll go through it again. So a splash attack, when you attack a creature, it doesn't just affect that creature, it'll affect the adjacent creatures. So on the surface, it looks as though the Tremor will only do 2 damage, but in fact it can do up to 6 damage if it's affecting your opponent's adjacent creatures. Of course, that depends on whether your opponent actually has adjacent creatures out, but that is the main part of the Tremor. Besides that, just to keep you updated, the elemental aura is still prevalent in all of these creatures, so there's no point in really covering that, as well as the cost of 3 mana is in all of these creatures, so there's no point covering that. So this is a bit of a faster video as we're looking at the unique individual abilities within these creatures. Alright, and up next is the Vapular, and of course it is sporting elemental aura as always. And it also has an attack called Crystal Blast, and Crystal Blast has a warding attached to it. Now what warding does in Shard means that you're attaching a token to your creature and it gives it immunity to a spell, essentially. But there are a lot of effects that will actually spend those wards. It normally ties in with a lot of arcane magic. So some magical spells will actually require wards on the field to tap into. So think of it as additional mana that isn't in your typical mana slot. You actually have them on the field, which means there is risk of losing them, of course, but you can exceed the 5 mana cap. Okay, and the Banshee, this was the birth of fear, this thing. I remember creating this card art when I was out having a coffee in a public place, and I was very paranoid about people looking over my shoulder and thinking, what the hell are you drawing? But there we are. Yeah, so it has Horrific Wail, which is an attack with fear. Now, as I explained before, fear is all about isolating your opponent. So when the Banshee attacks with fear, your opponent can't interfere with blocks and counters. It creates a one-on-one scenario for the Banshee. So it can be quite a deadly little effect to have attached to the Banshee, and something you have to be wary of if you're facing off against a phase deck. Now, the Ichatic, a poison elemental, it has Noxious Wall, which is a block with wounding. So when the Ichatic steps in to defend your own creatures, it isn't just blocking the damage and subsiding it, it's actually inflicting a wound onto your opponent, which is a great way of chip damage. It's slowly wearing your opponent down. Use this to your advantage if you've got the Ichatic. If you've got a poison deck, you'll see a lot of creatures with wounding. So there's a lot of ways to capitalize this. If you go on to shardtcg.com and search via spells, there'll be things that will interact with the Ichatic, and it's definitely worth building a fun little deck around. And next up we have the beautiful Nymph, the Fae elemental. Now this creature has Fairy Swarm, which is an attack with swarming. And it was one of our very early concepts, and it was tied into working with some other small fairy-like creatures within Shard Set 1. Of course, in Set 2, we've introduced more additional ones, and it is a lot more prevalent to make a Fairy Swarm deck. So this is something fun you can do with it. Of course, the Fairy Swarm isn't really tied in with the Fae element. As we can see, it also has Siphon. Now this is a lot more Fae, where it has attack with leeching. Now what the Nymph can do is actually attack with this, which means it won't be backed up with any swarming creatures, so you don't get additional damage from other fairy swarming creatures that would help the Nymph. Instead, you're attacking on your own, but you can gain Vitality, which will increase your Nymph's health. So pick and choose which attack you want to use with the Nymph, whether you need more Vitality or whether you need Strength in numbers, where you have to take out something a little bit larger than the Nymph. And the Reaver is all about frost and ice and cold, so it's naturally going to have a Sap ability. Now for people who don't know, Icy Thrash is an attack with Sap, and Sap means that your opponent's creature will actually go to sleep instead of resting, which means that they won't be awake and ready to use until the start of your turn rather than the start of your opponent's turn. So it gets you a little bit of time, it buys you a bit of time into prepping for the next move if you can't quite take out that creature right away. And of course this is paired up with Cool Presence, with the Reaver being a Frost type. Frost has a natural alliance to defensive type abilities, so a block naturally fit in with the Reaver elemental. And next up is the Spriggan, and this is another creature that also likes to sap, but we have it tied in with the countering instead of the attack with this creature. So the counter attack for this is Entangling Roots, which means if your opponent is coming in for attack, you can inflict 2 damage and then sleep your opponent. So it is a very annoying creature, and it's a little bit harder to take out with its higher health. Now the reason it's got a higher health is because it's Arbor, and Arbor naturally have high health, with them being tied into a lot of Vitality style play. But if you have a garden and you're looking to get rid of a rose bush or just any plant really, you know that they are hard to remove from your field. So naturally we added this into Shard TCG. Plants are difficult to get off the field, and even though this isn't a plant creature, it is an element of aura, which is very, very close to plants. The Grue, the elemental of shadow. Now shadow is about weakening magic, and it's a little bit sinister in that way. So the Grue has Shadow Bite, which is an attack that has weakening. Now what weakening does is it will bestow upon your opponent a weakening token, which will lower your opponent's attack by 1. Now on the other side, it also has Pursuit, where it's got a counter swarm. Now Pursuit is seen in a lot of shadow creatures as well, and it's a good way of teaming up, so there is the shadow counter. So it gives you that feel of, if you step into the shadows will all gang up and actually get you. It's that monster in the dark type feel. That's what we were trying to get across there. So a swarming counter ability seemed very in themed with the shadow element. And with a lack of shadow, we have light, to which I introduce you to the Wisp. And as you can see by the Wisp's rarity symbols, I've accidentally got the structure deck version of the Wisp rather than the regular set 1 version. But that doesn't really change anything about the Wisp today. It's just if you're wondering why the symbol was slightly different. So the Wisp has Gamma Sphere, which is an attack with Direct, and Direct pretty much does what it says on the tin. It can attack your opponent directly. Now the only way your opponent can defend against this is if your opponent has a creature with Guardian on it or a creature with Tormentor. Now Tormentor likes to force you to attack that creature all the time, where Guardian isn't quite the same. Guardian doesn't force you to attack it, but it will protect your life against your opponent when your opponent is attacking you directly. So Guardian kind of overrides that direct ability. Now the Reaver, as you can see, it's a bit of a blitz creature because it only has 1 health and 1 counter. It's not very bothered about those abilities, but it does have Arc Lightning, which is an attack with Pierce. Now Arc Lightning, if you go in with this and you hit a creature with Pierce, like the direct ability, it kind of does what it says on the tin. It does a piercing damage, so any excess damage that is above your opponent's creature's health will be inflicted to your opponent. So if you destroy a creature that has 3 health, then you're going to inflict 1 damage to your opponent directly. Of course, as well with Static Field, even though it's only a 1 counter, it does have Splash, which means if your opponent were to attack you with a type of swarm ability or anything like that, that splash damage will hit all the swarm. Though with 1 health, it's likely to not take out any of your opponent's creatures, but it's nice to have it there because in a very unique situation, it might just come in handy. The Vulcan, the elemental of lava. Now it has an ability called Molten Fist, where it does a large attack for 4 damage, but it has Over Exert. Now the reason this one balances up with the Reaver is it does have a little bit extra health and it does have a block ability, which does make it more sturdy when it's on the field. Now what Over Exert actually does as a drawback is it actually it sleeps your own creature. So even though the Vulcan's hitting for a massive 4 damage, it then has to sleep, which is a little bit of a disadvantage. It can leave it a bit vulnerable, but if you've got a couple of Vulcans out, you can always have the other one ready with a block ability to keep your Vulcan safe. Now the Zaffin, the elemental of acid, and as you can see, it's this horrible bony figure covered in acid. Very edgy, really, you know. It's great for some of the kids, they love it. Anyway, it has Acid Splash, which is an attack with Dissolve. Now the whole idea of Dissolve is that it can remove block tokens from your opponent. So if your opponent builds up a lot of defense, Dissolve really strips you of that. It is basically the anti-blocker. Now it was discussed a while ago if Dissolve should be able to remove other things and take things away, and it gets a bit of a funny situation because we have Vitality, which removes wounds, and we have Weakening, which removes strength. So naturally we want Dissolve that removes block, and we don't want it to remove additional things. The only thing that makes a difference is that blockers don't have a negative, so you don't get into a negative block. Perhaps that's something we should look at in the future. And now the Argus. The Argus has Chaos Orb, which has State Shift, and this is something you will see in a lot of Chaos creatures, not just the Chaos Elementals. So with the Chaos creatures, they like to have 2 states of the field, which means they normally come with 2 effects, whether the effect is entropic or extropic, depending on the state of the field. Now when the Argus uses a State Shift, it will start activating the other effects of the creature depending on the flip of the coin of the field, essentially. So the Argus really likes to mess around with a lot of that. It's got some very high damage but very vulnerable to being destroyed with only 1 health. And as design wise goes, I think this is one of Richard's best ones, but of course he's going to commit more to Chaos as he absolutely loves that element. But yes, beautiful little creature there. The Ajis, basically a ghostly suit of armor based around the element of order. Now how order works is it likes to have an advantage when you're at a disadvantage, and then it has a disadvantage when you're at an advantage, if that makes sense. A lot of the effects come into play when you are in a weakened state on the field. So if you have fewer creatures, normally order starts to kick in because it wants you to get back into that leading position. The only problem is once you're in that leading position, a lot of the effects tend to turn off. But going straight into how the Ajis works is it has lawful hindrance. So it has a block with strengthening, and this works around with a lot of order abilities as well. There is a lot of defensiveness to order as well, because they're about keeping order. They don't want to go on the offensive, they just want to maintain order. So think of it like a guard in a city. You know, they're not going to come and be offensive to you, they're not going to come and attack you, but if a fight were to go in place, order would want to step in and break it up. Now the Zephyr has an air slash attack which has direct. So just like light, it also has a direct ability, which is a nice little bonus for air to have. Though I don't think it's as prominent in air itself, it does like to use a little bit of this ability. So it's good to see it incorporated. The real challenge is having 21 elements and trying to have them all feel different. Of course, air tends to have its own gimmick where it likes to move around the field, which is something that I'm sure would have shown in the effect of this creature if we hadn't already had it in place to have elemental aura like every single elemental. Now the Gienact, it is a creature of earth and stone, and it likes to be defensive and hardy and doesn't want to be broken down. That's why it has 3 health, and it also has a block with shielding, and it even has a counter ability, so you've even got the option to stab it with that nice little quartz sickle thing that it has for an arm. But its main ability is the Robust Sediment, which is a block with shielding. So very similar with Order in terms of wanting to be defensive, except where Order has strengthening abilities when they're shielding, so they can go on the offensive later. Earth really doubles down on the defensive abilities and actually gains more shielding, so they're even harder to break down. So isn't that fun to do? So yes, Robust Sediment is a block with shielding, so if you were to block once, you would gain a shield, and now that will actually defend you against 2 damage rather than just 1. And then once again, it'll defend you against 3 instead of the 2. So there's a compounding effect with the Gienact, which is real fun. If you can keep the Gienact for a few turns, very deadly creature to have. But of course, we do have the strengthening ability with the elemental aura, so if you've got your fellow earth creatures either side of the Gienact, don't worry, there is some strength to actually go on the offensive with this playstyle. And then the Jengu. Now the Jengu is a water elemental, and what does water do? It splashes. So it has Deluge, which is an attack with splash, which means that if you target a creature, it will target the adjacent creatures as well. So similar to the Quake element, which also had splash. Of course, that was more about shock waves. This one is just basically you can't stop everybody from getting wet. Jengu wants to get everybody wet, so it's going to splash the thing in front of it, and it's going to splash its friends too and inflict 2 damage to them as well. What a fun little elemental to use. And then the Cinder. The Cinder has a wounding ability. So as you can imagine, if you stick your hand in fire, you're going to get hurt, and it's going to hurt for a prolonged period of time. That's why the Cinder has igniting impact, so it inflicts 2 damage, but it will leave your opponent with a wound. That doesn't mean that it inflicts a 3rd damage, it means that it leaves a wound token, which stops your opponent from healing back up to its maximum health again. So if your opponent has 3 health, you can inflict 2, which will take it down to 1, but leave it with a wounding. So at the end of the turn, when its health resets, if it does survive that turn, it will only reset back up to a maximum of 2 health rather than the 3 health it was originally on. So a good way of wearing your opponent down in such a way. Alright, and that is 21 elementals that is in Shard TCG. After set 2, we are looking at making an elemental deck where we're trying to make elementals actually work a little bit more in sync with each other. Okay guys, thanks very much for watching the breakdown. Please hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll catch you next time. Goodbye.